Hello and welcome to the Eating Disorder Therapist podcast. This is a podcast to help you find peace with food and overcome disordered eating. And I'm Harriet Frew, aka the Eating Disorder Therapist, and I'm so excited to share with you all kinds of stories, tips, information and guest interviews to help you on your journey in finding peace with food. So thank you so much for listening today. Now today, the episode is brought to you by the Eating Disorder Therapist Book Club. So this month we're reading Amy Harmon's Perfectly Imperfect, Compassionate Strategies to Cultivate a Positive Body Image. So if you're interested in joining the book club, what you get is 4 extra podcast episodes a month, a Facebook group to gain support and encouragement, although you don't have to join that. If you kind of prefer to be just listen to the podcast episodes and be a bit more on the edge of it, that's completely fine too. So you get this extra support, encouragement and motivation along your recovery journey. It's not therapy or a replacement for therapy, but it's a therapeutic intervention that can really just help you as you're trying to recover from disordered eating and improve your body image. So if you're a bit unsure if you want to join, you can dip your toe in the water first by hearing the first episode for free on the Eating Disorder Therapist podcast. So that's about 2 episodes back from this one. If you listen to that, it gives you a bit of a taster about what the book club involves. And then if you like it, you can sign up in the show notes. And what happens is you pay £5 or the equivalent of $7 a month for access to the extra episodes, the Facebook group and all those goodies. So I really hope to see many more of you there. Now today I have another guest on the show and I'm speaking to Jacqueline Davis. So Jacqueline is the Binge Breakers Podcast Host, Bulimia Recovery Coach, artist and loving dog mum. After recovering from bulimia, by focusing on habit and mindset change, she now helps others to do the same through her groundbreaking programs. So I'm really looking forward to speaking to Jacqueline today to explore her personal recovery story and her journey to becoming a recovery coach. So I was also recently a guest on Jacqueline's podcast, so do go and check this out. It's linked in the show notes. So I'm so looking forward to speaking to Jacqueline today. Let's get to the episode. Hi, Jacqueline, and thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
Thanks for having me, Harriet.
So Jacqueline, could you introduce yourself, please, to the listeners?
Yeah, sure. So I am the podcast host of Binge Breakers. It's all about bulimia recovery. I struggled with bulimia for around 4 years and disordered eating for long before that. And then after recovering in kind of a non-conventional way, I really wanted to help other people. So I'm now a coach as well. I help people through bulimia recovery. And yeah, other than that, I'm a dog mom. I like fitness and I walk my dog a lot and I do some art.
Oh, brilliant. No, well, thank you for introducing yourself. And what kind of dog do you have?
He's a Labrador mix. He's kind of a mutt, but he's mainly a black lab.
Oh, lovely. Oh, I love Labradors. And they have a great temperament, don't they, Labradors?
Yeah, he's a real shy one. And he also doesn't like water, which is just terrible because he's a lab. So, but we're working on it. We're trying to get him more comfortable with water. But it's so funny because usually Labradors love water.
Oh gosh, so like a bit of exposure, like kind of sticking his paw in maybe to start with.
Mm-hmm. Well, we've gotten him to get in the ocean, but he only will go in if you give him lots of treats. Then he's willing to do it. But otherwise, he will never get in on his own accord.
Sure. Oh gosh, how funny. Oh well, good luck with getting him in.
Yeah. Yeah.
So Jacqueline, obviously you struggled with bulimia yourself, but you said before that you struggled with disordered eating for sort of some years before that. So yeah, would you mind sort of taking us back a little bit and just tell us what was your relationship with food kind of like as a little girl, and what stage did your eating become more disordered?
Yeah. So as a child, I think I was fairly normal. There were things in my life that I didn't really realize may have contributed to my eating disorder. But, my mom was never one of those people that's like, you have to clean your plate. She didn't comment on what I ate or anything like that. And there wasn't any talk about, it was a relatively normal, healthy relationship with food most of the way. And I was an athlete. I ate a lot of food. It wasn't until high school that I had switched schools, which, at the time didn't seem like a big deal, but I really left all of my friends that I had known since kindergarten and went to a new school. And it was my freshman year of high school when my first bout of disordered eating kind of came into play. And it first started with just like really restrictive dieting and counting calories. And I think as I think back to it, it was partly because at the time my body was changing a little bit. It was going through, puberty and all that sort of stuff. And I think I just got uncomfortable with like suddenly seeing cellulite on my legs. And I also have been swimming. I was a swimmer for a long time, and then my high school didn't have swimming. So of course, when you stop a physical activity like that, my body just changed. And so I think all of that combined, plus like having a new friend group, I think I started to really want to get validation and just have something to focus on. So I started getting really obsessed with calories. And I guess what I'm thinking, when you say your story out loud, you're like, oh, and there's this and there's this. But I also, I always got appreciation for, this sounds weird, but for my looks. It wasn't like my parents would scold me if I didn't look a certain way, but at the same time, it seems like there was a lot of value put on the way I looked, and therefore I felt like I needed to uphold that. And so I think that contributed to it as well. But I did actually receive therapy for what was going on because it developed into bulimia. I started like binging at night. It was kind of hard to remember because it was a long time ago, but I started binging at night mainly. And I was like obsessively counting calories during the day. A lot of my friends knew something was wrong. They didn't know what to do. And then eventually my mom kind of found out over the summer that something wasn't quite right. And I confessed to them and they got me in therapy. And I don't remember much about that because it really quickly after getting therapy, it just kind of stopped. I don't know if it's because I felt more comfortable with my friend group and I realized it wasn't really that smart to be doing what I was doing, but it kind of quickly went away. But as time went on, I went back into all of high school went on. And then during my college experience, I started the first year of my college experience trying to lose weight. Because again, I went through a phase where I went to a new place and I didn't really know anyone. It wasn't a traditional college experience either. I wasn't in a dorm. I was in my own apartment. And so I started to get into training and fitness, which is a good thing. But then I started getting a lot more obsessed with weight loss and thinking I needed to lose just a few pounds. And my whole college experience was really tainted with the idea of I need to lose weight. And it was always like at first it worked really well. And then I would gain it back and then I would lose it and I would gain it back. And this is where I'd say it really got quite disordered because I really struggled. I started struggling with bulimia again in my senior year of college. But when I looking back, there were so many weird things I was doing. Like I would try not to eat for 24 hours and then I would just break down and binge after work or something like that and think it was normal. And I wouldn't have told anyone what I was doing. And I had forgotten about this, but I remembered it a few months ago. But I did attempt to throw up before in my sophomore year of college, but it didn't work. So I just moved on. And that's a huge red flag, right? But I didn't think anything of it because I didn't purge. Therefore, there's not an issue. And I was turning on social events for that. I was really isolating myself quite a bit. But then something changed. I decided to get involved in an exchange program in my school. And I went with 3 other American students to Manchester, England, which was the time of my life. I spent a whole year there and really, really enjoyed it. And I was so thankful because I was with 3 people all of a sudden. And when you are with people, they kind of can help you realize some of the behaviors that you have that aren't so normal. And so that was kind of a blessing in disguise. I didn't realize it. And also we were traveling a lot. And while I had a gym membership over there. I would go to the gym all the time, which was a good thing in a lot of ways. It offered me kind of comfort when I was, all alone in some ways in a foreign country. But I was able to forget a little bit about the weight loss. I didn't have access to a scale. There was a weird period my roommates remember where I didn't really realize it was strange, but I was just only eating protein powder for my meals. And I didn't, I didn't pick up on the fact that that's not okay. Something's wrong. But of course, my roommates didn't really know what to say or how to handle it. But thankfully, apparently, I started eating normal food again. So it wasn't a big deal. And then eventually, I feel like I'm rambling a lot, but eventually came home. And what had happened through all that travel, me not having access to a scale and kind of loosening the reins for the most part on weight loss, I had gained a lot of weight that I didn't realize I had gained. And I looked, I was at my heaviest that I'd ever been in my life. And so that summer I came home and I was like, this is it. I need to change something. I need to lose weight. This has got to be the final straw. And before then, of course, something was wrong. If you just looked back at my whole college experience, like, this is not okay. But then my thoughts started to turn really nasty towards myself. Like, something made a switch. And I don't know if it's because of the weight I had gained or something, but I started to say things that I would never say to any of my loved ones of like, you're disgusting. How could you get to this point? How could you let yourself go like this? You're kind of a waste of space, like all these sorts of things. And this was my senior year of college. So I think I felt a lot of pressure. I really wasn't happy in the degree that I was in, even though there were a lot of good things from it. I didn't know what I needed to do or what I wanted to do. And so I think all of that combined was causing me a lot of stress. But anyway, I started another diet. And it went normally at first, but what happened was, as time went on, I started to get more restrictive because I wasn't losing weight as fast as I desired. So I started cutting my calories back and cutting it back, and to the point where I was eating, like 400 to 800 calories a day, not good at all, obviously. And I was just so obsessed, and I was cranky all the time. One of my roommates from England, she moved in with me for our senior year, and she was just like, yeah, you were a real piece of work that time of year, because I was just eating, nothing and cranky. And it got to the point where for Christmas break, I opted to just go home for a few days and then stay at my apartment the rest of the time, because I knew I had a long break and I could just isolate myself. And all I need to do was go to the gym, then come back home, eat the small meal that I would have, and then just, work out and that sort of stuff and watch Netflix. Like, that's all I would do. And so it got pretty bad. And then I don't know how much detail I guess you want me to share, but eventually what happened was I had a day where I was only a few weeks out from my goal weight, but I felt I had some sort of food in my house. I think it was like these Thinsters cookies or whatever, and this really low calorie ice cream. And I don't know why I had them in the house, because at that point I was scared of food. I really didn't keep things like that in my house anymore because I was so worried that I would lose control. It was just like, keep it out of the kitchen. But I ate some of that and I was just so hungry that I binged on it. And then the fear of gaining weight back, because I had yo-yo dieted so many times, I was like, I've done so much work. I can't let this happen again. I can't go back to that place. And so I tried to purge one last time, and it actually worked for some reason. I don't know why up until this point, but then I just remember sitting there in the bathroom and thinking, like, what have I done? This is ridiculous. I'm too old for this, all these sorts of things. And then I, vowed this is never going to happen again and no one can know. And that was another big thing for me. I was like, I can't tell anyone. I don't know why exactly I thought that, but I just didn't want to bother anyone. So anyway, I made sure there's no evidence. And then, of course, things got progressively worse from there. So that's kind of where everything originated. Does that explain it well enough?
Yeah, no, I mean, thank you for sharing. And, if it's okay, perhaps I can just pick up on a few things actually just from your story, because I'm sure so many people listening will relate to different aspects, and, just quite helpful just to sort of talk through some of it. So, yeah, what I'm just really struck by as well is just going right back to I guess the earlier days, before it was perhaps, full on bulimia or anything. But I just think some of the things that you were talking about, are quite common triggers for people, not just struggling with eating disorders, but maybe with mental health generally. So like you're saying, in a way, the switching school, at the time, it didn't seem such a big deal, but it could be a huge thing, can't it, when you're kind of moving away from your friends and at that kind of quite vulnerable age where it's so important to feel that you're fitting in and you're kind of part of a social group. It's quite a big transition, isn't it, changing schools?
And I was just so shy from when I was a toddler. I was super shy. I would hold an elbow out in front of my face so no one would talk to me, no strangers. So me, a really shy person, going into a new high school altogether, even though I was really excited, it really was a strange transition and a big transition. And if you feel like you didn't fit in or felt like anything was wrong with you, you can start doing some strange things to cope. And, eating disorders and just calorie counting and weight loss in general, that can become a really great distraction for you and kind of your own relationship in itself. So you don't have to worry about other things and, yeah, you're right. I didn't put it together at the time, but now looking back reflectively, it probably was a really huge trigger for me.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think just what you're sort of saying there as well, that kind of distraction and something to really focus on. Because I think as well at that age, even if you're not aware of it or have the kind of vocabulary for it or kind of awareness, like just feeling accepted, feeling part of a friendship group, feeling liked is just, it's kind of almost a bit crucial for survival, I think, isn't it, in adolescence? And if you perhaps feel a little bit on shaky ground with some of that, it's so seductive, I think, to feel like, oh, well, if I, control my food, maybe change how I look, I'm going to feel better. And sadly, the culture can reinforce that as well, can't it?
Well, people gave me attention for doing what I was doing. It wasn't necessarily good attention, but people were concerned. They would ask me things. Also, I wasn't, super popular, but people did know something about me. And I guess when I was in high school, I did take confidence from that, people know that I am dysregimented and all that sort of stuff, and that I have this problem. And I guess I took some sort of confidence from that when I didn't have much confidence about anything else.
Yeah, no, sure. I suppose it sounds like it was almost a little bit of a kind of identity, wasn't it, as well? Like, yeah, something that you had, something that you were sort of known a bit for that made you a bit different or interesting even.
Absolutely, yeah. And it was a small high school. So, and you're right, a lot of listeners out there can probably relate. I've heard people tell me similar stories of, this is what I have one person on my podcast, and she said, I became known as that girl. And even though looking back, it's so sad, that was my identity, like you're saying.
No, sure. Yeah, no, I think many people will relate to that. What I'm really interested as well is like just this whole thing about when you stop swimming as well. Because I think as well, like obviously exercise generally, playing sports at school, it can be so incredibly positive for mental health and physical health and well-being. But I think again, it can be, I just think of some of the people that I've worked with that like maybe danced for years and then suddenly stopped. And, I think if you've done a lot of exercise intensively, it can be quite an adjustment, can't it? When your body perhaps suddenly does kind of catch up a bit almost with your peers when you stop exercising as much.
Yeah, it just not only does when you're in a sport, especially as a kid or as an adult, it gives you a sense of community again, and it gives you some goal to work towards and part of your identity. But it also, your body's used to a certain level of activity. And then, of course, it's not always that your body changes for the worse or something. It's just your body looks different because you're not doing what you're doing regularly. So it just adapts. And that's what happened to me. And I think that whole combination was a lot more toxic than I realized. And it was hard to deal with, even though I didn't really realize why it was hard to deal with.
Yeah, no, sure. And it makes a lot of sense. And then the final thing I wanted to pick up on as well is just this thing about kind of, you being very appreciated for your looks. And, I guess in a way, people that did that around you, I'm sure were doing it with like kind of great intentions. And, I think it's just a sort of normal thing, isn't it, that we kind of do in our culture in a way that, if we see that someone's attractive or we kind of like how they look, often compliments would just very easily flow, won't they? But it's, I think people sometimes think, obviously, it's incredibly detrimental to someone's self-worth if they've had a lot of negative comments about their appearance or just negative comments generally. But it's also quite interesting, isn't it? Because I think also it's the flip side. And actually, sometimes we can think that by praising someone for how they look can be really, really helpful. But I guess, your example just says sort of firsthand how that isn't always as helpful. And it, again, perhaps does it feel a bit like a pressure sometimes, or like you said, having to uphold it?
Yeah, it wasn't, and it sounds, I feel weird saying out loud, but that is what happened. I did get a lot of compliments, I don't know, it's a strange thing to say, but I got a lot of compliments, particularly from my family and relatives. It was the first thing that they would say to me. And that's just because it's an easy thing to comment on someone's looks. But yeah, it did feel like this pressure. And I didn't get a lot of compliments for my academic work. I didn't get a lot of compliments on my personality. I got compliments on my artwork, and I got compliments on how I looked. And, it wasn't always bad. Some people would say, you're so nice, that sort of stuff. But that became what was really important to me. And I even remembered thinking as a kid, when I grow up, what's important to me is, being beautiful and having an amazing career. And as long as I have those things, that's it. And obviously, as you grow up and get older, it's a lot more complicated than that. And that's not the only things you should work towards. But yeah, and it can have a detrimental effect either way. And what you say to people really does matter. And if you only compliment them on that, they're going to think something's majorly wrong if you stop complimenting them, or, that's what they thrive on. And I think I thrived a lot on external validation. And sometimes I still can struggle with that. So.
Sure. Well, no, thank you for sharing. I think, just really valuable for people just to reflect on that. So, Jacqueline, as well, what I'm really struck by is, when you sort of went on to talk about some of your other experiences and how your eating, sort of the eating disorder developed, is just almost like the sense of isolation that you felt at the different stages. It sounds like as well that your world became very small, didn't it? Very sort of insular. You must have been quite alone, but just very preoccupied, I guess, with food and exercise, and almost a bit in a sort of little bubble almost, and quite isolated from other things in the world that were going on.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And it's been funny because I went through all of this and I've really uncovered a lot through working and having, my coaching business and having the podcast. When people ask me things, I'm like, oh yeah, that does make sense, because you don't think about your journey as often. But I really was isolated. And part of that's because I'm just a shy person naturally. So instead of going into a college experience where college almost helps you make friends in a lot of ways. They put you in a dorm, they have orientation week, there's lots of events. I went to a small private arts college. And while that was a really good thing, it was just not a great thing for a person like me, because I could easily just withdraw and go back to my apartment. And then my first roommate situation that I did have a roommate in my first apartment, but we were in such separate age groups that we didn't get along very well. And there was part of the time where she was just gone. So we weren't really good friends. I didn't have any solid friendships till I went to England with those roommates. And I'm really thankful for that, because that was really bonding. But most of the time I really was I would go to a few friend things. I would sometimes put myself out there, but I would say probably at least 70% of the time I was just alone. And saying that, it does feel really sad, because that really was the case, but no one was there to really tell me that something's up, something's wrong. And that's the problem, is with eating disorders, you can justify so many things and you can start doing things and not realize that what you're doing isn't normal. And then it just keeps escalating. And it's sometimes helpful to ask yourself, why wouldn't I tell someone about this? If someone else saw this, would they question it? But even during that time, I didn't even really realize there was a problem. I just thought, this is my life and this is okay.
Yeah, no, sure. I mean, I think it's hard to see the wood for the trees, isn't it? And you sort of almost become in a tighter and tighter sort of spiral, or like, I don't know, like this kind of spinning hamster wheel where you almost like you haven't even got time probably to get off the wheel for a minute, because you're thinking about your next workout, your next meal, or your next whatever you've got to do. It's just kind of, you kind of just like lose perspective, don't you really? But you don't realize you've lost perspective. You're just kind of so in it.
That's a perfect term for it. Yeah, I had completely lost perspective. And especially those are crucial years when you're trying to figure out, what am I as an adult? Who am I? Who do I want to be? And so it developed into something that really wasn't very helpful at all, for sure.
Yeah, no, sure. No, it's a tough time, isn't it? I think that kind of emerging adulthood from sort of like, your late teens to your sort of early to mid 20s, obviously, like, I just think back to my own experience, like, so many fun, amazing things happen, but also some really down times too. And it's quite hard, isn't it? It's quite hard growing up, I think. And, putting yourself out there in the world and all the kind of pressures and almost kind of all the different choices and opportunities, it can just feel really, really overwhelming.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's a time where you see everyone go to college and you think like it's this formal path you're supposed to follow and everyone figures it out. And as a teen, you think, oh, you go to college, you get a job and that's that. But a lot of times that's not how it works out. Sometimes you go to college, you don't like your major, you don't even know what you're doing. And it's really messy. And I guess I wasn't necessarily prepared for it like most people are. And so my bulimia, when I was struggling, I told you about the lead up to it, but then after I was struggling with bulimia in my early 20s, I really felt like it was just a mid-20s crisis altogether, just crazy floundering, like trying to figure out what I wanted to even do in my life. And bulimia really served as that identity while I was trying to figure it out.
Yeah, no, sure. What just struck me as well, Jacqueline, is that year when you did come to over here to the UK and Manchester, and just the fact that being around other people ended up being a real positive for you in that year, didn't it? And like in terms of being able to just kind of perhaps, I don't know, just having that kind of feedback from others, maybe that more support and encouragement and just not being so isolated.
Yeah. Well, and my dad got me a gym membership there because he thought, she likes fitness, and he thought he was doing me a good thing. And there's a lot of benefits to exercise, but I was still there. I was still kind of, like obsessive with certain things. And my roommate, the female roommate, she ate a lot less than me. So I'd always compare myself to her and all this other stuff. But the thing that was so helpful is they went out and did stuff and they brought me along with them, and they also like, when I wanted to withdraw and retreat, they would knock on my door and be like, "Hey, Jacqueline, want to watch a movie?" And I was like, "Oh, okay. Yeah." So they really kept forcing me out of my shell and kept giving me opportunities to get out of my shell. And that was just so beneficial because it left less room for the eating disorder to come in.
Yeah, no, sure. And I think just such a powerful message really for anyone listening, isn't it? Because I think when we're in the depth of an eating disorder, like the last thing you feel like doing is being sociable, isn't it? And talking to people and getting out there. But actually, when you do it, sometimes it can be the most beneficial thing.
Yeah, it really can. If you can have someone in your life to force you to do that, that's amazing. But when you are in that space, it's kind of like when you want to go for a run or something and you don't really want to do it. And then you kind of push yourself to go for it. And then you feel grateful afterwards. You kind of have to get into that mindset. But yeah, when you're in your eating disorder, you don't feel like doing it at all. You don't feel like going out, and you have all these thoughts in your head that are convincing you to stay. So they really at the time forced me to just bypass that altogether and hang out with them, which I didn't realize was probably incredibly beneficial.
Yeah, no, sure. Friendship's just so important. So Jacqueline, for you as well, with kind of like recovery and like, 'cause it sounds like maybe some of your recovery kind of happened a bit just like with kind of circumstances changing and growing up a bit, becoming just a bit more sure of yourself. But what do you think, what are some of the main things that really helped you kind of properly recover from bulimia and get out of the kind of real depths of that kind of low place?
Yeah, well, at my worst, because after that kind of scene where I binged on those cookies, I struggled with about like 4 years. So after that, I moved to be with my partner out in Colorado. We had been dating since like senior year of high school. And so I made the switch there. And that helped to just have someone to live with, even though it didn't make everything better. And at some points it got worse, just having someone there. Eventually I told him a year after we had moved in together, just because I knew that I needed help. I knew that it wasn't going to go away on its own. At least that's what I thought. And I was just like, I need to figure out how to talk to someone. And there's no way I'm going to be able to do that if I'm just like sneaking around. It's going to be strange. I'm already sneaking around to binge all the time. So I really need to tell him. And I also felt, extremely scared and guilty. I felt like I was lying to him, all these sorts of things. And obviously, when I told him, he didn't think any of these things. He was just supportive and kind and everything. But telling anyone, I think is one of the biggest steps in recovery, because when you keep it all in your head, you kind of feel crazy. And I had made up all these stories about myself that weren't true. And just telling one person, even though I didn't recover till years later, really helped me get perspective again, as you were saying, because he didn't say, "Oh my goodness, you're this crazy person, you're this monster, you're this liar." He just thought, "Oh yeah, you have a problem and we should get help for that." It was very calm and collected. So that's probably one of the first things. And then the big thing I did, which is kind of hilarious, is the whole time I was struggling with bulimia, I was trying to recover. I unfortunately couldn't afford therapy at the time. I didn't have insurance. So I just felt like I was out of luck. But the whole time I was trying to recover, I was also simultaneously trying to lose weight and trying to look up weight loss advice. I never, ever looked up how to change your mindset, how to work on your mental health. It was only about kind of weight loss tactics and how to recover from bulimia. And even that, I don't think I looked hard enough for how to recover from bulimia, because now that I'm recovered, there's a plethora of information out there. But, at the time I was just so laser focused. Thankfully, though, I stumbled across a podcast that talked about weight loss, but they also talked about changing your mindset and how you talk to yourself. And and habits. And I was like, oh, there's a huge piece of the puzzle that I'm missing. And it's that I'm treating myself horribly. I'm saying horrible things to myself all the time. I'm not, I'm just kind of becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. So the biggest thing I did outside of telling someone was actually trying to work on treating myself with respect and kindness and shutting down those thoughts in my head. And that's sometimes easier said than done, depends on where you're at. I definitely had depression throughout that, but thankfully I was able to pull myself out of it with just really focusing on how my mind was working and actually trying to focus on positive things to say about myself and changing over time. And then eventually I invested in coaching for myself, and it wasn't even, this is the hilarious part, it wasn't even for bulimia because there wasn't anything like that. It was just for general life coaching. But I started working on my life and I started kind of working on how to change, my career. I really was struggling in my relationship. I wasn't really showing up in it at all. So how to change that sort of thing. I started kind of focusing on other areas instead of just bulimia and weight loss. And that helped expand my life. I think you talked about this in my podcast, but it helped me see that, there's hope. There's things that goes on here. There's more to life than just losing weight and, making money. And that really helped me start to pick up the pieces. And then lastly, what kind of nailed the coffin for me in bulimia recovery is that, I was honest with my boyfriend about what was going on. And I also was really investing in my mental health at that point. And I was really working hard on treating myself kindly and with respect. Then I kind of gave up weight loss. And then I realized bulimia for me was very habitual. There was this whole habit cycle that was going on with my binging and purging. It happened every day at the same time. It was always because of these certain triggers. So I started to look at bulimia as a habit. And then I was able to actually quite easily cut binging and purging and stop it altogether. So yeah, a lot of things went in there to recover, but that's kind of a synopsis of it.
Yeah, no, sure. Brilliant. Well, thank you for sharing. And I think I've just spoken to I just think of several of my clients who I've worked with over the years have been suffering from bulimia and in a relationship and, have kept it from their partner for, years sometimes. And I think it's sometimes then it can also it becomes such a shameful secret, and they kind of feel like, oh my goodness, I've been keeping it secret for so long. If I said anything now, it's going to just be terrible, and it's going to destroy the relationship.
They feel like a liar, like they're betraying their partner or something.
Yeah, no, sure. Well, it's awful, isn't it? It's like having like a double life, really, if you've been living with someone and they don't know. But I think what's just really helpful is you sharing how you did speak to your partner then, and actually that was such a helpful thing to do, being open and honest, and actually to get some support as well through that.
Yeah, and I was really fortunate that sometimes people can have really adverse responses. They're not very nice at all, and I was blessed that he was very kind and receptive. And he also gave me space. He wasn't like lurking over my shoulder all the time to make sure I was doing what I said I was going to be doing, which was helpful. He kind of had healthy boundaries with me from the get-go. And he just was there when I needed him. And then sometimes he would also point out abnormalities going on with me. Like I remember one time we were having a conversation and he kind of said like, you're doing better on the whole bulimia thing, right? And I laughed and I was like, oh, it's only like once or twice a week right now. And he was like, what? And I said, oh, it's not that bad. And he goes, no, that's not good, Jacqueline. And it kind of brought me back into reality again. So it was so beneficial. But yeah, I had all the same drama that your clients have had, where I think that I'm betraying them. And bulimia kind of is like a secret relationship. So you do feel like you're running around with almost like someone else, but you're not. And I would tell those people, it's kind of all in your head. I think if you got to think, if someone were to come up to you and tell you the same thing, you would probably respond with a lot of compassion and love. And your partner probably cares about you really deeply, and they care about you just getting better, especially if you came to them and were just honest with them. It'll probably be okay.
Yeah, no, thanks for sharing that. And I guess it's, like you're highlighting really, hopefully for most people, it would be a really positive experience, but I guess it's just worth reflecting a little bit ahead as well. You're wanting to speak to someone, aren't you, who, generally is an accepting, kind, supportive person. And it sounds like what was really helpful with your partner as well is that you were able to have some kind of healthy boundaries there, Because I think there is nothing worse, is there, than like if you'd felt like he was breathing down your neck or something. That would have been really, really tricky if you'd felt like really watched and observed all the time.
Yeah. And that happens. I have one of my clients that's a struggle with her partner, and he kind of can amplify the situation and make her feel even worse, if she is doing those things. And it's kind of like, you don't need that extra pressure. You're already trying to recover from something. You also don't need the extra pressure from someone else. At least I don't think it's very beneficial. So sometimes it's helpful if you can, obviously, like you said, make sure the person that you're talking to is accepting and loving, is that you feel safe talking to this person and you trust them. But then it's also maybe helpful if you're going to tell someone to actually tell them what you think you need. And you obviously can't control another person. They're going to do whatever they want. But if you lay out the expectations, that might be helpful for them, because sometimes people, they don't know how to respond. So it might be helpful for you to tell them what you need.
Yeah, I think such a great point, actually, because I think a lot of people understandably really don't really understand eating disorders. I think if you haven't experienced one yourself, or if you haven't experienced someone close to you having an eating disorder, you are probably a bit at sea knowing what to do. So I think it's such a good point that actually it's helpful to kind of communicate what you do need and what is supportive.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes people that are the ones struggling with bulimia, they can then put too much pressure on their partners to hold them accountable. And then it's not helpful either. You need to have a relationship that works for both of you guys.
Yeah, no, very, very true. And I think the other point I wanted to pick up on about your recovery as well is that the thing about kind of giving up weight loss, or the pursuit of weight loss, is such an interesting one, isn't it? Because I guess for you and I now, looking back on that and you talking about that, it seems such an obvious thing. But, when you're in the depths of it, and it feels like often the solution, doesn't it? If you're having these binges and purging and everything, it feels like weight loss restriction, that's the thing that you should be doing somehow to rectify the whole situation.
Yeah. Well, it feels like, especially when I was so out of control with food, I'm like, if I could just find something that tells me how to correctly eat, then the problem will be solved. The problem is the fact that I'm binging all the time and consuming food and treating food like a junkie. It would be so nice if I could figure out the magic secret to eat food like a normal human being and lose weight along the way. And weight loss kind of coincided with that. So to my mind at the time, when you're in that, it makes sense. But it doesn't make any sense now looking back on it. It's like, yeah, that was a really obvious thing. But, the alternative a lot of people think to giving up weight loss, I put on the shelf for a while, was that you're going to just completely fall off all your wagons and never pick up fitness or health again. And that's also what I thought in the back of my mind, is like, if I give it up, then I give it up forever. And that means I give up my health, my fitness, everything. And that's not the case at all.
It's such a great point, actually, isn't it? Because I think, I could just think of several of my clients as well that are really getting that all or nothing thinking. So they're almost terrified of giving up the pursuit of kind of perfect eating, because it feels like the only alternative, is kind of chaos, just being completely out of control, gaining weight uncontrollably, just this, just feels like just such a terrifying place. And I think such a great point in a way, there is that kind of middle ground, isn't there? You don't have to completely chuck the baby out with the bathwater. You can still enjoy fitness, and you could still, enjoy, having a healthy relationship with food, putting good stuff in your body. It doesn't have to be, does it, one extreme or the other?
Yeah, absolutely. It was important for me to make mistakes with food in the beginning too, to figure out how to eat normally again. So it was really important phase to kind of feel a little bit out of control, but then it quickly came back and tenfold. And there is a middle ground after I recovered, which basically, I think, it's kind of hard to frame, because I stopped binging and purging. Once I figured out that if it was for me, the habit analogy worked really well. So once I figured that out, I was able to stop binging and purging really quickly, within a month. But before that, I had done so much work on my mindset and changing my life and stuff like that. So that all combined. But then after I stopped binging and purging, I still was kind of chaotic with food. And so then I really just I was like, okay, we are going to drop weight loss for a little bit, and we're just going to focus on trying to eat like a normal human being. And that was one of the scariest things I think I ever did, because I was really worried about everything. But it actually turned out to be a really wonderful time. And I gained so much confidence with food. And I realized I don't want to eat like 3 things a night because I feel terrible. So it turned out to be a really good learning experience for me.
Yeah, no, that's so great to hear. And Jacqueline, can you just share as well just a little bit more about, like you said, like when you kind of viewed the bulimia as a kind of habit as well, and then kind of worked on changing it as a habit, like can you just share with the listeners like a couple of tips that are kind of helpful in kind of breaking habits?
Yeah. When you look at bulimia as a habit, like the binging and purging in particular is that habit. I think a lot of us are comprised of habits. It's really just, you have this loop going on in your brain where there's some sort of trigger that happens. Sometimes it's like malnutrition. Like at first when I started binging, it happened on accident and I was so hungry. And then the trigger to cue me that food. And once I started eating that food, I realized it was actually really rewarding and really enjoyable. And then a loop started to be formed of, oh, we're hungry, let's get food. Eventually, I started binging just because I was stressed. That was another trigger that was happening for me. And I was like, okay, stress, let's go for food, that sort of stuff. And then sometimes it just became, I'm bored. There's any sort of emotion I was feeling, any type of free time I had, whatever. I was like, let's just binge. I just had random urges to binge and I couldn't figure it out because it was so weird. I'm like, it's the middle of the day. Why do I want to binge? But I realized it's just what I had trained my brain to do. There's like this primal brain in me that's like, we get food, we feel better, you feel rewarded, therefore let's do it. This is just our activity. And I can't make it mean that there are so many things about me that was broken, that I was just, basically destitute to do this for the rest of my life. But really what I had to do is interrupt that habit loop. And this is what I also teach people, is that basically what helped me was, there's a point before you go onto autopilot, because when you're in a habit loop, kind of like when you're driving your car and you forget your turn, but you don't crash into anyone, it's because you're still driving, but your brain's on autopilot. So you're just kind of doing the motions. When you are going into that binging and purging loop, you're kind of going into autopilot. And so what I had to do was I had to become aware first of when I was binging and purging, what was happening during this time, why on earth was I binging and purging? And then I had to catch myself before going to autopilot. So for me, I would go into autopilot the second that I decided we're going to the grocery store, or when I was in the grocery store, or when I was standing in front of the fridge. Then it was too hard to go back. Or when I started to eat food, then I was on autopilot. There was no going back. Of course, you can stop anytime you like, but it felt too difficult to stop when I was already going through that automatic habit loop.
Yeah.
And then over time, when I started to like catch myself, I was like, okay, how can we stop that autopilot? I had a really insightful coaching session with a coach. Her name is Janet Archer. And bless her soul, because she didn't struggle with bulimia at all. But I brought this to a coaching call because I was like, I need to stop this binging and purging thing. And I was like, I know this is a habit. And I know I don't want to do it anymore, but I keep on doing it. And she was like, have you tried pausing? And I laughed because I was like, no, I guess I haven't. That sounds ridiculous. But she was like, pausing is not a time to distract yourself. It's a time to just make a decision. It's a time you can just stop and decide whether you want to do it or not. And basically what I did with the habit loop is I had gotten really good at like, okay, this is when I binge. This is what happens. It's typically on my way home from work. And so on my way home from work, I would stop and pause when I noticed myself going down that road. And I would sit and think, like, do I actually want to do this? And also I would feel whatever emotion was going on. So instead of like running and avoiding it, which is what binging was for me, it was an emotional like coping mechanism. I would just kind of sit with what was going on instead. And then it would give me space to actually slow things down. It basically stops the momentum.
Yeah.
And then I was able to actually make a clear decision. Because when you try to make a clear decision when you're running all around, it's really hard. But when you actually just stop everything, you're able to clearly see what's going on. And that allowed me to stop my habit loop. And then over time, the urges went away. And I was actually able to just, sometimes they still come up, actually, to be honest, but they're just sound kind of like neurological junk at this point. They're just like weird passing thoughts. But at first, they would just kind of come up, and then I was able to pause, stop, get through them. Now, the only thing I want to say is that I had done a lot of work emotionally before this. So it was a lot easier for me to let go of binging. So sometimes when I work with clients, it's really hard for them to pause it because they still really don't necessarily want to let go of bulimia, and they have a lot of other stuff going on. But that's how I stopped the actual of it. And that's what I would suggest someone try.
Sure. No, such valuable tips. I really appreciate you sharing those. So Jacqueline, where can people find you if they would like to get in touch with you about coaching or listen to your podcast? Where do people find you, please?
Yeah, my podcast is just Binge Breakers, Bulimia Recovery. You can find it on most major platforms like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, and YouTube. And my website is just bingebreakers.com. And my Instagram, I think, is bingebreakers_bulimia. I'm actually not sure what my Instagram is, but you could just type in Binge Breakers and I'm sure that you'll find it. It's all the same thing. So that's where people can find me.
Okay, no, brilliant. Well, I'll make sure we put all the details in the show notes. That's great. Well, Jacqueline, I just want to say thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. And I really appreciate your openness and vulnerability in sharing your story and for sharing, your journey and your sort of healing with food. It's really been so encouraging and inspirational to hear.
Thank you. I really appreciate you giving me the time to talk about it. And I hope that it resonates. I think just talking about these things, it's healing for me to talk about it. And it's always nice to actually have a conversation with someone who has been there themselves.
Oh, thank you.
So I hope you enjoyed this conversation just as much as I did. And do go and check out all of Jacqueline's details in the show notes. So if you're not following me already, do seek me out on Instagram at the Eating Disorder Therapist. And for further support in your relationship with food, do go to the eatingdisordertherapist.co.uk. Also, just to be aware, if you're listening and you are a therapist, nutritionist or counsellor and you're looking for further training in eating disorders, I'm going to be running some training courses in September and October. So if you go to my website, theeatingdisordertherapist.co.uk, you can find more info about all of that. If you want to join the book club, you can sign up in the show notes. The link is below. And if you enjoy this podcast, I'd be so grateful if you would follow, rate and review, as it helps it reach so many more listeners. Thank you so much for listening today, and I look forward to sharing another podcast episode with you very soon.